Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Operation Paperclip,
Operation Paperclip.
unearthing this fascinating and morally complex history of how the U.S. brought Nazi scientists to work for them after World War II.
Yeah, it sounds paradoxical, doesn't it?
It really does.
The very nation that fought against Nazi tyranny ended up recruiting the minds behind some of its most fearsome technologies.
Yeah, we're going to be uncovering the stories of key players like Wernher von Braun, but also diving into the lesser-known figures and the programs they worked on.
Right.
Think of it as a journey through declassified documents and first-hand accounts and historical analyses
Sure.
where we'll uncover some shocking truths and grapple with some really tough ethical questions.
And you'll discover how the race for scientific supremacy, particularly with the Soviets, really played a huge role in shaping Operation Paperclip.
Right.
Imagine, barely a year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. was already deeply concerned about the Soviets catching up in the nuclear arms race.
That fear really set the stage for the lengths the U.S. was willing to go to acquire German scientific expertise.
Yes.
That's where the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, comes in.
Okay.
This agency was almost single-mindedly focused on bringing these scientists into the U.S. fold.
Now, to understand why German technology was so coveted, we need to look at the V-2 rocket program.
Okay.
Wernher von Braun, who would later become a household name in the U.S. space program, was a key figure in developing this terrifying weapon.
The V-2 was essentially a supersonic ballistic missile.
Exactly.
Picture this. During the war, cities were being bombarded by these missiles that were impossible to intercept with the technology at the time.
The V-2 was built in the Middle Work Facility, a massive underground factory that relied on slave labor from the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp. It's a chilling reminder of the dark side of this technological marvel. Thousands of prisoners suffered under horrific conditions, often under the supervision of individuals like Arthur Rudolph, who would later become instrumental in the American space program.
It's a stark contrast.
Right.
Rudolph goes from overseeing slave labor at Middlework to being hailed as the father of the Saturn V rocket, which launched Americans to the moon. It really highlights the moral tightrope the U.S. was walking with Operation Paperclip.
This raises a question that I think is important for you to consider. How do we reconcile groundbreaking scientific advancements with the morally reprehensible conditions under which they were often achieved? It's a theme that runs through this entire story.
And as we dig deeper, this moral quandary only intensifies. One of the key documents that comes into play is the Ozenberg list. A classified roster of top German scientists compiled during the war.
Think of it as a who's who of German scientific talent, including those involved in rocketry, aeronautics, and even chemical and biological weapons research. This list became a goldmine for the JIOA, allowing them to target specific individuals for recruitment.
It's pretty unsettling to think that the U.S. was actively pursuing scientists who had worked on some of the most devastating weapons imaginable.
It was a calculated risk, driven by the fear of falling behind in the Cold War arms race. The list even included figures like Dr. Hubertus Strohold, who would become known as the father of space medicine.
Strohol's story is particularly fascinating and troubling. On one hand, he made significant contributions to aviation medicine that were crucial for human spaceflight.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand,
his early career is intertwined with the dark history of human experimentation at the Dachau concentration camp. During the war, the Luftwaffe conducted horrific freezing experiments on prisoners to simulate the conditions faced by downed pilots.
So while Strohold was pioneering aviation medicine, these atrocities were happening right under his nose within the Luftwaffe.
The connections and the moral implications are undeniable. Strohold, through his position, almost certainly knew about these experiments, and yet he went on to become a leading figure in the U.S. space program.
The story of Operation Paperclip unfolds against the backdrop of the Nuremberg trials, where high-ranking Nazi officials were being prosecuted for war crimes. It creates this incredibly complex situation where the U.S. is trying to bring these criminals to justice while simultaneously trying to utilize their knowledge.
It was a delicate balancing act, to say the least.
Yeah.
A great example of this moral conflict is the story of Dr. Walter Schreiber.
Okay.
He was the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich.
Right.
And a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
He actually testified against his colleagues at Nuremberg,
Wow.
exposing horrific details about human experimentation.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Despite his role in revealing these atrocities, Schreiber himself was later recruited by Operation Paperclip and worked for the U.S. Air Force, contributing to their research on aviation medicine.
It's a stark reminder that the lines between justice and pragmatism were incredibly blurred during this period. The U.S. was willing to work with someone deeply entangled in the Nazi regime's medical crimes, all in the name of scientific advancement.
And this pattern repeats itself throughout Operation Paperclip. We see it again with the Ambrose affair. Dr. Otto Ambrose was a high-ranking chemist with IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that fueled the Nazi war machine. He was directly involved in developing nerve agents like sarin gas.
And perhaps even more disturbingly, he was the plant manager at IG Farben's Buna factory at Auschwitz, a facility built using slave labor from the concentration camp. Ambrose was a wanted man, sought after for his war crimes.
Yet, he too was a target for Operation Paperclip. The U.S., despite knowing his past, was interested in acquiring his knowledge of chemical weapons.
It's almost inconceivable that a fugitive from justice, wanted for crimes against humanity, was being pursued by the U.S. government for his scientific expertise.
What makes it even more incredible is that Ambrose, for a time, managed to evade capture.
Wow.
With the help of American officials who prioritized his knowledge over his past, it clearly shows the conflicting priorities within the U.S. government at the time.
This entire deep dive is full of stories that will make you question how such things could have happened, and it gets even wilder when we look at the case of Dr. Kurt Blum.
Blum was a leading figure in the Nazi regime's biological weapons program.
What?
He was actually put on trial at Nuremberg, but...
He was acquitted, right?
Yes. The evidence presented wasn't enough for a conviction, and that's where Operation Paperclip steps in.
So, after being acquitted of war crimes related to biological weapons research, he was recruited by the U.S. to continue working on biological weapons.
Precisely. Blum ended up working at Camp Detrick in Maryland, the heart of the U.S. Army's biological warfare program. The irony is almost too much to bear.
It's a glaring example of the long-term consequences of Operation Paperclip. In their pursuit of scientific advantage, the U.S. ended up employing some of the very individuals who developed the weapons they feared most.
And this wasn't just limited to weapons development. As Cold War anxieties escalated, the CIA became obsessed with mind control techniques and interrogation methods, fearing the Soviets had mastered brainwashing.
So how does Operation Paperclip tie into all of this?
Well, the CIA turned to, you guessed it, former Nazi scientists for help. Individuals like Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, who had experience with Gestapo interrogation techniques, became involved in programs like MKUltra and Artichoke.
Those are the CIA's infamous mind control projects. Experiments that often used unwitting subjects and involved unethical methods like using LSD and other psychoactive drugs.
The involvement of these former Nazi scientists adds a whole other layer of moral complexity to the legacy of Operation Paperclip. It makes you question the ethics of using knowledge acquired through such compromised means.
As we move towards the end of this part of our deep dive, it's essential to consider the lasting shadow of Operation Paperclip.
It's a shadow that stretches far beyond the Cold War. It shaped the space race, influenced modern weapons research, and continues to raise questions about the relationship between scientific progress and ethical responsibility.
It's astonishing to think that many of these scientists remained anonymous for decades. Their pasts were kept secret, protected by the U.S. government. It really makes you think about how history is written and how we grapple with the uncomfortable truths that sometimes emerge.
Absolutely.
It's almost like the U.S. was caught in a moral tug-of-war. They wanted to advance scientifically, but they were relying on people who had committed these terrible acts.
Exactly. And it's not just about the big names and their involvement in these top secret programs. The book also sheds light on the lives of those caught in the crossfire, the people who witnessed the horrors firsthand.
One such story is that of Karl Hollenreiner, a prisoner subjected to the saltwater experiments at Dachau.
These experiments, led by Luftwaffe Dr. Wilhelm Begelbuck, were an attempt to find ways for downed pilots to survive at sea. They forced prisoners to drink seawater and deprived them of other sources of hydration to see how long they could survive.
It's a truly horrifying example of the lengths to which they went in the name of research. What's remarkable is that Holland Rainer actually survived the war.
He did, and he later testified at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, one of the subsequent trials that focused specifically on the crimes committed by Nazi physicians.
Can you imagine the tension in that courtroom? Holland Rainer, still bearing the physical and emotional scars of those experiments, comes face to face with Begelbuck, the man who orchestrated his suffering.
It must have been an incredibly powerful moment, a testament to the pursuit of justice, even in the face of unimaginable trauma.
And what was the outcome?
While the judges acknowledged the cruelty of the experiments, the sentences handed down to many of the defendants, including Begelbuck, were surprisingly lenient.
It's a sobering reminder that justice is rarely straightforward, especially when dealing with crimes of this magnitude.
And the situation gets even more complicated when we factor in the Cold War. As tensions with the Soviets escalated, the U.S. government's priorities shifted. Prosecuting war criminals took a backseat to gaining a scientific and technological edge over the Soviet Union.
So did Operation Paperclip essentially become a way for former Nazis to find a safe haven in the United States?
In a way, yes. The urgency of the Cold War created a sort of shield for them. The screening process for scientists coming into the U.S. became increasingly relaxed, and many individuals with questionable pasts managed to slip through.
Is there a particular example that stands out?
The case of Dr. Theodor Benzinger is a good illustration. He was a renowned physiologist who was deeply involved in organizing a conference in 1942 on the medical challenges of sea and winter distress. This conference, as we've mentioned, was where data from the Dachau experiments was presented and analyzed.
So Benzinger was directly involved in those discussions.
Absolutely. He was an active participant, presenting his own research and engaging in discussions about the findings.
And yet, despite this clear involvement, he managed to secure a position working alongside American physicians and researchers at the Army Air Force's Aeromedical Center in Heidelberg.
It shows how far the U.S. was willing to go in the name of scientific progress. They often turned a blind eye to the pasts of these scientists, prioritizing their knowledge over their actions.
It seems like the moral compass of Operation Paperclip was getting increasingly skewed.
That's a fair assessment. And this trend only intensified in the later phases of the operation, particularly with a program known as Accelerated Paperclip, or Project 63.
What was the driving force behind this program?
The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 significantly heightened Cold War anxieties. The U.S. government felt an immense pressure to acquire any knowledge that could give them a strategic advantage, and they needed it fast.
So Accelerated Paperclip was basically a way to fast-track the recruitment of these scientists.
Precisely. It was designed to bring in especially dangerous top-level scientists, often bypassing the already weakened screening processes. The rationale was that these individuals, no matter their past, possessed expertise too valuable to let fall into Soviet hands.
It sounds like the Cold War truly became a convenient justification for overlooking the past.
That's one way to look at it. Take, for example, Dr. Kurt Bloom, who we discussed earlier. Despite his involvement in the Nazi regime's biological weapons program and his acquittal at Nuremberg, he was still considered a valuable asset.
So the U.S. essentially gave him a second chance, overlooking his past for the sake of his knowledge.
Exactly. And he wasn't alone. Accelerated Paperclip brought in many others with questionable pasts, including Dr. Walter Schreiber. His medical expertise was deemed too valuable to pass up, even though concerns about his wartime activities were mounting.
It seems that at this point, Operation Paperclip had morphed into something far more ethically compromised than its original intent.
I think that's a fair assessment. The desire to win the Cold War had taken precedence over holding Nazi war criminals accountable. It's important to remember that Operation Paperclip was very much a product of its time.
It's easy to judge the decisions of the past through the lens of our modern-day understanding of human rights and international law.
Indeed. But it's crucial to consider the context. The U.S. felt an existential threat from the Soviet Union and believed these decisions were necessary for their survival.
These choices were undeniably ethically fraught, involving compromises, overlooking transgressions, and choosing pragmatism over justice.
Yet, they also had a significant impact on history, shaping the scientific landscape and influencing the development of new technologies. Their legacy is still debated and scrutinized today.
It feels like we've been navigating this moral maze with all these complex figures and the compromises made during Operation Paperclip.
It truly is a labyrinth of ethical dilemmas. And as we move into the latter stages of Operation Paperclip, things get even murkier. It becomes a story of defections, double agents, and disinformation campaigns, all set against the backdrop of escalating Cold War paranoia.
One figure who perfectly embodies this sense of intrigue is Major General Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, who we've talked about earlier. Remember, he testified against his colleagues at Nuremberg.
Yes, and his story takes a dramatic turn after those trials. He ends up in Soviet custody, where he claims to have been coerced into collaborating with them.
So he was caught between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Exactly. But then, in a move straight out of a spy thriller, he reappears in West Germany in 1948, claiming to have escaped from the Soviets.
His defection must have been a huge blow to the Soviets.
It was a major propaganda win for the West and a significant embarrassment for the Soviets. However, the details of his escape remain shrouded in mystery, and there were suspicions that he might have been a double agent playing both sides.
And to add another layer of complexity, he was soon recruited to work for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, providing intelligence on Soviet chemical warfare capabilities.
It's a prime example of how tangled the web of allegiances and deceptions had become during the Cold War. Here you have a former high-ranking Nazi official who had testified at Nuremberg working for the U.S. military and claiming to have outmaneuvered the Soviets.
Talk about a complicated character. So where does Operation Paperclip go from there?
As we move into the 1950s, the moral compromises at the heart of Operation Paperclip take on a new dimension with the U.S. government's growing interest in mind control.
We touched on this earlier with MKUltra. The CIA was clearly concerned about Soviet brainwashing techniques and was willing to go to great lengths to counter them.
Exactly. They launched several top-secret programs, including MKUltra and Artichoke, focused on exploring ways to manipulate human behavior, often using psychoactive drugs and other experimental techniques.
And as we've seen before, former Nazi scientists were brought in to contribute their expertise.
It's a chilling reminder of how the pursuit of knowledge, when detached from ethical considerations, can have dangerous consequences. The CIA, in its quest to control the human mind, turned to individuals who had been part of a regime responsible for some of history's most horrific atrocities.
It's a truly disturbing thought. Did the U.S. government ever acknowledge the ethical implications of all this?
Public awareness of these programs was minimal at the time. The CIA went to great lengths to conceal its activities, destroying documents and silencing anyone who threatened to expose the truth.
Are there any specific examples of this cover-up?
One tragic case that highlights the lengths to which they went is the story of Dr. Frank Olson. He was a bioweapons researcher who became increasingly disturbed by the CIA's mind control experiments.
What happened to him?
Olson, after witnessing some of these experiments, started to question the morality of his work. He expressed concerns to his superiors, suggesting he might go public with what he knew. Shortly after that, Olson fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. The official explanation was suicide, but many believe he was murdered by the CIA to silence him.
That's a dark and disturbing turn of events. It really underscores the level of secrecy and the lengths to which they were willing to go to protect these programs.
The circumstances surrounding Olson's death remain controversial to this day. It serves as a haunting reminder of the dark secrets that still linger beneath the surface of this period in history.
So how does Operation Paperclip ultimately play out as we move further into the Cold War and beyond?
Well, as the Cold War intensified and the nuclear age dawned, the legacy of Operation Paperclip became increasingly intertwined with the military-industrial complex. The U.S. government's obsession with maintaining technological dominance led them to invest heavily in weapons research and development.
And the scientists brought over through Operation Paperclip continue to play key roles in these programs.
Absolutely. They contributed to the development of advanced missiles, cutting-edge aircraft, and even space exploration technologies.
It seems like a classic case of the ends justify the means. The U.S. was willing to overlook the past transgressions of these scientists to achieve their goals.
And that, in essence, is the crux of the moral dilemma presented by Operation Paperclip. But it's important to remember that these compromises didn't go unnoticed.
So there was a public reckoning of sorts.
Yes. As the truth about Operation Paperclip gradually came to light, there was growing public outrage. Journalists, historians, and human rights activists began piecing together the puzzle, revealing the extent of the U.S. government's collaboration with former Nazis.
Did that lead to any concrete actions?
Yes. The U.S. government, facing mounting pressure, was forced to confront its past. Investigations were launched. Trials were held. And some of the most prominent figures involved in Operation Paperclip were finally held accountable for their wartime actions.
It seems like Operation Paperclip ultimately became a cautionary tale.
It certainly raises profound questions about the nature of scientific progress, the limits of ethical responsibility, and the consequences, both intended and unintended, of decisions made in times of crisis. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and power, if not guided by a strong moral compass, can lead to devastating outcomes.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring the complexities and moral dilemmas of Operation Paperclip. What's the one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to ponder?
Operation Paperclip is a powerful reminder that the lessons we learn from history can inform our present and guide our future. By understanding the choices made during this tumultuous period, we can hopefully navigate the ethical challenges of our own time with greater wisdom and compassion. This deep dive has only scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover about this complex and unsettling chapter in history. We encourage you to delve deeper into this story by checking out the book. You can find the affiliate link in the episode description. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.